Well, hello and welcome back. I am Guy Stevens. This is the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint live series. Really excited to have you here with us today. It is Thursday, February 15th. It's 3:30 here on the Eastern Time Zone, and I have a special guest with us today. But let me first start off by telling you a little bit about who I am and who the Alliance is. Of course, I am the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, an organization that we started. Gosh, it's been just about 5 years. In fact, we have a 5-year anniversary coming up here very soon. The Alliance was formed really around issues dealing with restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment. More broadly speaking, all the things often being done to kids, very often in the name of behavior. We began to work to change policies and practice, and we do a lot of work today to try to change outcomes and ultimately, hopefully, have an impact on ending the school-to-prison pipeline. Really excited, as always, we have another great guest with us today. I've got Zach Morris, who's the founder of Alive at Learn. Zach's an educational and family support consultant, and I'll be introducing Zach here in just a moment. We're going to be talking a little bit about kind of lessons learned from working with neurodivergent learners, and I think that'll be really interesting. So I do want to let you know, as always, today's session is being recorded. So these are always recorded. We stream them live. We stream them on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and on Twitter. So you can watch them any of those places. And of course, you can go back to any of those places after the fact and watch them as well. We also make them available as an audio only podcast. So if you prefer to listen, maybe on the go, in the car, and while you're traveling, whatever it may be, you can go back to Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you get podcasts, and you can download the podcast and listen to it there as well. As many of you know, we now have a couple of sponsors that are helping us with the podcast. Which is really great because it's helpful. These things, of course, take time and resources to create, and we've got a couple of fantastic sponsors that have been helping us out. I want to share with you something here today from Supportable Solutions. Supportable Solutions is one of our amazing sponsors, and they've got some really fantastic news. A product that they've been working on for quite some time is going to be launched, and I think its launch day is about a day away, if I'm not mistaken. And we're actually going to do a special event about it as well. But it is called the Y Toolkit, and I'm actually going to play a quick little spot here about the Y Toolkit to tell you a little bit more. But be on the lookout to hear more about that very soon as well.
This updated functional behavioral assessment and behavior intervention plan is a game changer. For once, parents don't feel like they're being blamed for their child's behavior. This web-based assessment guides support teams along their journey to discover the causes of distress behavior in individuals, all while, at the same time, utilizing a visual approach to help shift perspectives. The Y Toolkit helps educators and others ask the right questions when a child is struggling with behavioral challenges, leading to answers that will build regulatory capacities and robust nervous systems. I highly recommend it. The Y Toolkit is a testament to the fact that we all do well if we can.
And the toolkit will be launching very soon. And of course, you might have seen the endorsement there from Dr. Mona Delahook, who is an amazing human that we love and always enjoy having the opportunity to work with as well. But if Mona likes it, you know it's something really fantastic. So we're excited about that. So let's go ahead and get on with our show, and let's get to the part that you're waiting for, which is our special guest. So I want to introduce to you our special guest today, and we're going to have a conversation, and you're invited to participate in that conversation as well. So as all of you know, if you're watching live, you have the ability to ask questions and provide comments. And of course, I always like to start the show by saying, let us know who you are and where you're from, because it's always fantastic when we go on live to have people letting us know where they're watching from and who they are. And it's kind of like we see some of the regulars here as well, which is always great. But it's always great to have new people as well. So Zach Morris is an advocate for learning and personal agency. His work aims to help individuals, families, and schools build structures that honor autonomy, celebrate strengths and interests, and prioritize a sense of safety and connection. With a focus on trauma and neurodiversity, Zach offers a lens into psychophysiological experiences we can have as humans, and he offers support strategies for helping ourselves and our children learn, heal, and grow. Zach, really excited to have you here today, and excited to have you here for a conversation and to not only learn more about you myself. You and I have had a chance to talk previously, but to share with you, share with our audience, who you are and the work that you're doing. So, Zach, thank you for spending some time here with me today.
Thanks, Guy. I'm really grateful to be here.
Absolutely. A pleasure to have you here. So let's kind of dive in. I want people to have an opportunity to learn a little bit more about who you are, the work that you do. And I think there's some topics that are very relevant to what we do here. And of course, as I was reading through your introduction there, so much of it just kind of resonates with the work that we do, and safety and connection. I mean, those are my words that really mean so much to me and to the work that we're doing here. So let's dive in, and I wonder, so I gave a little bit of background on you, and you are remind me, you are, I want to say, in Montana.
I'm in Montana. Yeah.
Okay.
In Livingston, Montana.
Okay. Yeah. And so how are things out in Montana these days? I don't know many people in Montana, and I remember when I met you and you told me you're from Montana, it kind of surprised me. So,
yeah, we're a small state. I think we just crested 1 million people, not too long ago. So
yeah,
it's a big area.
Well, and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
You're like,
a lot of
don't want to
spaciousness.
see her getting out, right? So tell me a little bit. Let's set the stage for this. And I know a little bit about kind of what you do in terms of consulting and supporting families, and know kind of the things that are important to you in terms of beliefs. But let's talk a little bit about kind of who you are and how you came to this work. So the work that you're doing today. How did you get involved in supporting families and supporting individuals?
Yeah. I've always just been so drawn to those that are not finding success in the venues that exist already, right? And so I originally came into this as like a high school English teacher, right? Fresh out of college. I went in wanting to be in education. I think I realized I wanted to be more of like a mentor role, but it was like, oh, how do I do that and make a living, right? I'll become a teacher. And quickly got into education, and was really disenfranchised, was really underwhelmed with what I was seeing, right? And I was just seeing the actual needs of students not really being the priority, right? I was really seeing kind of like the needs and wants of the adult world, right? And I just sort of saw such a huge discrepancy between the experiences of students and the experiences of all the adults. And so I kept working my way into kind of more non-traditional education, right? Everything. So I've worked in everything from, inner city charter schools to rural public schools to private independent schools to homeschool co-ops, right? And in private therapeutic boarding schools, I even did a little bit of a stint in, and we could talk about that. And I found myself really wanting to support students in discovering more of their experience that they're having and finding out what really lights them up, what their needs are. And so as I kind of got into more and more of these non-traditional realms, I started to get to like access that more, right? Because the model were allowing for more of it, but I kept wanting for more. Like I wanted to go further with it, right? And I'd like brush up against hitting another model where like there was still a compliance need, or there was still something, right? And so it just sort of pushed me further and further. And that's what sort of led me to ultimately starting my own school that I had for about 8 or 9 years. That was a nonprofit, non-traditional school, predominantly served, atypical profiles of autism and other neurodivergent profiles, kids that had been kicked out of everywhere, refused to go to the school options that were available. And that was really what kicked off then a lot of this work.
Mm-hmm. And what initially, drew you to education? Do you recall? Was there an experience or something that kind of drew you to education in the first place?
Yeah, I think, I just being super curious, just myself in general. Like I was also really interested in learning and deep diving into stuff, right? And special interests and all these things. And then when I was in high school, and so I was like never really, like school for me was not for academia. School for me, right? That was like not the area where I felt really like I thrived or I felt really connected to. And in my high school years, I had a couple teachers that I felt like I really got connection with, and I really got understanding from, and I really got to explore those things that were relevant and important to me. And I just so valued that experience and what that brought up for me and what I wasn't getting before. And I was like, I want to fuel that. I want to facilitate that for people. And so it was really just wanting to, I guess, be on the other end of being seen and being heard in the way that I experienced with some of those teachers.
You know, I mean, and what you're sharing with me doesn't really surprise me in terms of it. It seems like there are others that kind of have a similar kind of, I guess, transition into education where, you know, maybe their early experience wasn't the best, but then somewhere along the line, somebody took the time and somebody connected with them and somebody made a difference. And I guess as I asked you that question, I didn't know the answer, but, you know, wasn't surprised to hear that. So was it a particular teacher or two that really did it for you?
It was, I think, and it was then actually getting brought into some of that material that then I got to like explore more. So that was where I found myself actually like exploring some literature and some writing in ways where I was like previously not interested at all. And this was like allowing me to learn more about myself and tap into myself. Right. And so I think that was like a whole new space too, was like, whoa, maybe there's more for me to even explore if I just have the right support or facilitation or whatever that is. Right. And, but yeah, I mean, this was to even the degree that like, I wasn't convinced I was going to college, you know, and so like, that was like the level of disinterest in some of this education. Right. But it was that relationship, and it was that opening the curiosity up further and opening up myself to myself more.
Right. And I'm going to go back to two words in your intro about connection and safety, because, you know, when you have that connection, you begin to you know, feel safe. The things that can emerge then are incredible, right? You know, so often we're focused on the academics, but if we're not focused on that foundational piece of helping kids to feel connected and seen and heard, and providing that safety, we're not gonna get to the, you know, the cortex. We're not gonna get to the thinking, rational, wanna, you know, learn part of the brain, right?
Yep. Yeah, I think about how when we have a sense of safety, our exploratory system comes online, right? And that's so essential in education, right? Is like, that's what we're trying to fuel, is like exploration into things, because in exploration, there's risk, there's vulnerability, there's like, so to function from that place of safety. And I think that's what I realized is like, so many students that are in school just are not sitting on that platform each day. That like in this space around these people, in this environment, like I feel safe to be me.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so critical. That's so foundational, but so often missing. And, you know, if you look around today, wow, it's a tough world out there, both as an educator and a student.
Yeah.
And much of what we're doing doesn't seem to be working, right? You know, we see anxiety and stress levels going up among kids. We see, you know, a lot of mental health concerns out there, and a lot of what we're doing is not working. But we don't seem to be evolving to some of the necessary changes. So let's reflect on it for a minute on your experience as you got into, you know, teaching, and you went into schools kind of after finishing your degree. What was it that you saw that you didn't think was working? I mean, what were some of the concerns that you had that kind of led you to the next steps of your career?
You know, kind of, we can get into the details, but kind of from like a reductionist standpoint, I think I just saw that it was built on a foundation of compliance. Right. Like that the whole model was built on a foundation of compliance. And so that left such little room for opportunity, for connection, right? For exploration, because there was a to-do list. There was all these things to get to. And basically what I saw was like the things that were on that to-do list were not relevant to the students in my class. So all of a sudden I was tasked with trying to make things relevant to them, as opposed to trying to figure out what's already relevant to these kids and how do we fuel that, explore that, connect with other things that are connected to that, right? And so this was like my first job I took out of college was, and this is like even before I did my master's work. I was working at an inner city charter school in Phoenix, Arizona, and I was teaching. And I originally was going in to be like a high school teacher, but I was teaching middle school at the time, and I had 7th graders in my class telling me, Zach, I don't care about reading this book at all. I'm just waiting till I'm old enough to drop out of school and sell drugs with my brother. And I was thinking like, oh my gosh, we've got it all wrong then. Like, why am I asking you to read Lord of the Flies? Like this is so not what's applicable to your life right now. And
and you know, you're speaking my language when you talk about kind of the you know, the problem with compliance. I mean, you know, I often say, like, if compliance is the goal, it's the wrong goal.
Yes.
You know, I mean, of course, we need to, you know, work with and support children and create safety and create connection. You know, yes, we need to work well and get along with others and lots of other important things. But the premium on compliance, I think, is actually done a lot of harm. I mean, and I think it leads to a lot of harm, especially for, I think, certain kids that are far more likely to find themselves, because of compliance, on the wrong side of restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, becoming disengaged, you know, school refusal, all of these things. Yet there's such a focus on it. There's such a focus on that compliance piece. And of course, you know, I'm by no means an expert on all of this, but you know, my understanding is a lot of our modern school system really kind of goes back to the Industrial Revolution. And, you know, we were, you know, the purpose of schooling was really, how do we create compliant factory workers?
Exactly.
And I think that actually is really serving us poorly today. Because in the name of compliance, you know, people continue to do a lot of things that aren't working and that, quite frankly, are harmful.
Totally. And to your point, right, of like on what's not working and like how we're trying to address that conflict, essentially, right? Like that tension, you know, and a lot of my work has also been inspired by Marshall Rosenberg's work in nonviolent communication, right? And one of my favorite things that Marshall Rosenberg says is to practice the process of conflict resolution, we have to abandon the goal of getting people to do what we want. Right. And it's like, and that's what I think about with school all the time, is like, we're just still trying to do the same thing in so many of these models and programs, right? Is like, there's an area of conflict, but the way that we're trying to navigate the conflict is still trying to get the kids to do the thing that we want them to do, as opposed to like totally come back to the drawing board and go, what's this experience like for you? What do we really value? What are we really curious about? Like, what happens for you when we start working on this and you notice like your heart starts beating fast? Like, what's going on there, right? Like, these are the things that I am curious about in education for kids, way more than like, how do we get back to that writing practice?
You know, this conversation reminds me of a illustration, and many people might have seen this, and you might have seen this before as well. But it's a really thought-provoking, simple illustration from Neurowild, who is a speech language pathologist and illustrator in Australia, who does these amazing, you know, I think the work takes these very complex things and simplifies them into a single frame or a multi-frame kind of illustrations. But there's an illustration of you know, somebody with a clipboard standing next to a pool, and a child behind them kind of drowning in the pool and taking notes, you know, failed to comply with the order to swim or something to that effect, right? So we become so focused on compliance that we're not getting where we need to get. So, you know, there's a lot, you know, so you get in and you begin to kind of notice, you know, things aren't working. But of course, the flip side of that is that, again, very often so correct me if I'm wrong here, but you know, maybe you're a little bit of a disruptor and somebody that if things aren't going the way you think they should, that isn't afraid to stand up. But you know, when we bring up people through these compliance-based systems, very often a young educator gets into a system and this is what they do, and maybe it doesn't feel right at first, but we're so focused on compliance. Sometimes we just kind of end up doing these things,
Yeah.
regardless of the fact that they're not working.
Yeah.
And, we often talk about kind of there's a lot of amazing kind of educators and others that, we work with doing this work. And I think about the Trauma Informed Educators Network, and Matthew Portell there has a saying about being an unapologetic disruptor, right?
Yeah.
Like we need to disrupt some of these systems that aren't working.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, in the name of compliance, people are often hesitant to disrupt. So we have a system that's not working well for teachers. We have a system that's not working well for the students. And something needs a change, right?
Yeah.
So you had this kind of journey and this kind of awakening, and of course you started your own school. So tell us a little bit about that and the experience that you had, and kind of what you learned along the way as well.
Yeah. And, and it was built out of pretty much what you're talking about, right? Which is like, okay, I've realized that I can't get behind this model of education that seems so sort of standard and rampant with most of my opportunities to go be an educator. I'm not willing to try to change it from the inside like that. I had already had that idea. I was like, I know I'm not willing to try to go do this from the inside. And I had grief about that, right? Because I know someone's got to try to do that, right? Like I know that that's good work, right? I just knew I wasn't going to be the guy who could handle that, because I just couldn't, right? I couldn't handle that in my own nervous system. I had too strong of convictions about some of these things, right? And so I knew I was going to go around in some way, right? I was going to go around this in some way. And honestly, this had come off the heels of I had sort of worked myself into, again, more and more non-traditional, and I had ended up at a therapeutic boarding school, an all-girls therapeutic boarding school in nowhere, Montana. And this opened me up to a lot of amazing schools of thought, right? And more sort of, this is where I learned about nonviolent communication, actually, right? Like introduced me to a lot of really cool things. And I also, once again, was confronted with some pretty intense things about a model that I just couldn't support and I couldn't really get behind, right? And we want to talk about seclusion and restraint stuff, right? Therapeutic boarding schools are definitely part of that conversation, right?
Right.
And so I left. I needed to leave. I couldn't be part of it, right? And so I left, with the lint in my pocket, not knowing what I was going to do with myself, right? And sort of landed back in a safe place where there's some friends and family and could kind of get my feet under me while I figured out, because I left before I had another job, right? I just could not be part of that, right? That model. And so I just started doing what I called supportive mentorship with kiddos. And this was more as I was looking for work and trying to figure out what I was going to be doing, and people kind of knew me a little bit and had heard what I do. And it was like, oh yeah, I could work with your kiddo a little bit. Right. And this is where I was like, it was really the autistic population that was seeking me out a lot. And was really just serving as another safe, healthy adult who wasn't mom or dad, who could help this person, that be seen and heard, spend some time with them outside of school, help them again, feel connected to somebody. Maybe we'd start exploring things, getting them thinking about some things differently, right? And just ended up having some really strong connection and some good experiences with these kids. And it wasn't, and some of these kids were not even in school at this time, right? They'd either left or dropped out, or they were kind of homeschooling, unschooling, something, right? And
and that happens to a lot of the people that we work with here in this community, because when your kid's being restrained, secluded, having a lot of these things happen, there's a point where parents don't. I mean, in fact, I was there myself at one point, didn't feel safe sending my child back to school.
Exactly.
But unfortunately, I mean, not everybody has that option. I mean, that's a really tough place to be. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I was working with those students, and soon those parents were like, hey, what are we doing in September? We're not trying to send our kid back to school. And this swirling, nebulous, abstract 5-year plan I had about starting a school was like, well, we're starting a school this fall, so if you want to enroll, we could do that, right? And I just kind of and this is just tribute, right, to me being 23 years old and strong convictions, and having gone through my own autistic experience of special interests and deep dive, right? And I'm gonna do this, right? And had some people that were either had enough trust or felt desperate enough or whatever, right, that we got into it. And I started the school with 3 students and, 250 square foot space. It was that we did a lot of community immersion, with, and it grew from there. Right. And it eventually turned into, 25 kids. We had whole staff. We had a 4,000 square foot facility. Right. And it was, and we can talk about the details, but really it was pretty grounded in an unschooling model. Right. It was grounded in radical consent. It was grounded in radical compassion. It was grounded in you getting to have your autonomy and safety preserved. And the reductionist idea is if we built a school, we're given the option at the start of a day to go to school or not go to school. What would school need to look like where the majority of the time they would choose to come? Right. That was how we sort of set off to build this, right? Because what I knew was that in all the other places I was, kids didn't want to be there on the whole, right? Of course, there's outliers, right? I'm not trying to speak about everybody, but there's an overwhelming majority of people that just did not want to be there. And I knew that if this was gonna be successful, kids had to want to be here. Right. And so a lot of our students started part-time. A lot of our students, right? Like maybe I'd see them once every 2 weeks as they built that safety and trust to go, you know what? It's better here than it is at my house. Because my house is just kind of boring. It's not that it's bad. It's just boring, right? Like
nothing against two parents there, right?
Exactly, right?
Yeah. But I mean, it's such an important point. And I mean, again, if we look at, what needs to change in many places. And again, there are other people out there doing things like you've done. And, there are other schools out there that I think that are moving in a far better direction. But there's a lot of places where that's not the case. Yeah. And it breaks my heart and kills me a little inside when you think about, kids are just such natural learners and so curious and want to engage. And we have this mismatched system that not only can kind of stifle that curiosity, but then, you find that, so many of our children, and if we dive into neurodivergent children, we dive into, some of the children that are more likely to have these things done to them, even at a greater risk, is leading to a failure for so many of these children. And again, it's amazing. Dr. Bruce Perry often talks about kind of his model, the neurosequential model, and kind of the idea that, regulate, relate, reason, right? So that, the idea that when you begin to feel safe and you begin to feel connected, that other things emerge. Yet we try to force these things, even things like, social skills. We're going to force this into something rather than creating that safety and that connection and that environment that helps these things to kind of naturally emerge, right?
Yeah. Oh, totally. And I think about that, through the kind of like the lens of maturation too. If we just think of like maturation as like a general concept, I'm not even talking about just like human maturation, right? But even if we just think of like the maturation of trees or like that like the way I make sense of that is that things mature at their pace given the right conditions, but inside of the right conditions, there's maybe no way to like expedite that maturation. It's just then it's time, then it's maintenance of those conditions, right? So when I think about that in the landscape of education, I'm like, yeah, we can't drive some of this stuff any faster. We just have to make sure we really have the conditions right and we're really maintaining those conditions. And then be super open to the idea that it's going to have different timelines.
Well, and as you're kind of talking through that analogy, I'm thinking about kind of the growing human being kind of idea here. And of course, there's a lot of knowledge and information we have out there today that still is not as widely, I guess, either known or followed. But I mean, even thinking about human development and brain development and our nervous system development, I think people often look at very young children through a very adult lens and don't really even, kind of understand the fact that, our brains develop in a very, a very defined way, and the way that our brain develops, the, kind of our prefrontal cortex fully developing last and going into adulthood. you know, it just, you know, the idea that all behavior is a matter of some choice. And I mean, so
Yeah.
many, I think, misconceptions and ideas that are so damaging. I want to pause for a second and just to welcome a few of the people that have jumped on here and said hello.
Sure.
Because it's always great to see people joining in. And I want to kind of shift after that into a slightly different direction. We've got Heather here, a parent of a non-speaking neurodivergent child in Seattle. Jennifer, who is one of our amazing volunteers as well and an amazing advocate from Davis, California. We've got Deborah Ann from Orange County, California. Excited to listen live. Christina from Cleveland, listening. We've got Ruth here. That's the name that looks familiar to me and probably to you as well.
Hey, Ruth.
From Indiana. And we'll hit on PDA a little bit later here as well. Mom of twins, both likely both PDA. Erica as well, from Indiana. And let's see, looking forward to your presentation at the PDA North America Conference, which is coming up here real soon. We've got Colleen here. Glad I caught this. Mom of neurodivergent twins from Massachusetts. Let's see. Oh, okay. Well, we've got some conversation happening here. I'll pass on some of that there. We've got Rachel here from the UK. Let's see, somebody from Arizona, so probably catching in, and Michigan and New Jersey. So people from all over. And I often say as we get started here, like, you know, it's not unusual that we have kind of an international audience. We get people from, you know, the UK and Australia and New Zealand and all over the world. So a lot of people hopefully tuning in to hear you live and hear your story. So kind of thinking through, you know, as you go on this journey and you begin this, I mean, again, as I hear you, I'm like 23 years old, making, wow. So you start this school, the school grows, you know, you continue probably, you know, kind of learning and expanding and finding what works and what doesn't work. So I want to kind of dive into, you know, kind of our topic area here. You know, one of the things that we wanted to really talk about were kind of lessons learned from working with neurodivergent learners, and wanted to focus on, you know, really what were some of the significant things that you've learned and probably continue to learn. I don't know about you, but, you know, I think learning's a process that really never ends. And if it does, then we're not in a good place. So, you know, what are some of the things that you've learned now over this time that you've kind of started out down a path and you've started your own school and you began doing some consulting work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I appreciate that. You know, the first thing that's coming to my mind is the commonality and thread of like the shame experience that I can see students go through. And that especially for kiddos where that's not being communicated outwardly, right? And that was something I really got to know at the school. I felt like, right, because the school was, I mean, we functioned on a 1-to-4 ratio most of the time with staff. So was able to have a lot of, you know, interaction with students, connection with students, right? And just seeing the ease upon which someone can slip into their shame cycle and how big of a block that can become to even pursuing their own interests, their own wants, right? And then could just fuel the big narrative. So I think what I learned was to become really sensitive to when that shame cycle was coming online and coming to like notice it, even when it wasn't being communicated verbally, even when some kid wasn't just saying, gosh, I'm so terrible and I'm, you know, this, but like how else was I knowing or noticing, ooh, someone's going through that self-deprecation right now. Someone else is going through that self-hate right now. And what do they need there? What's accessible there?
So in thinking about, again, the support and kind of the school that you were running, are there, you know, and again, you know, you started with, you know, families that you've begun working with and families that had not been well served and, you know, you started something, but are there particular success stories that kind of come to your mind as you think about your experience doing that and kind of the difference in transformation it made for families? Yeah,
totally. You know, I can think about one of the early students I had, you know, that stayed with us and ended up, you know, doing his high school graduation with us and moving on to other things. You know, when that student started with us, there's, you know, neurodivergent profile, Also trauma, some school trauma and things, right? That this student would come again, maybe a couple times a week. I'd see them, right? Because that's as much as they could make it out. That's as much as they could make it to school. And we would get to school, they would get to school, and we'd start working on things. And very quickly, dysregulation would be online, right? And we don't have relationship yet. And so next thing I know, this person could have been at school for an hour, and they've already decided they're leaving for the day, right? This was like a 16-year-old student. And it was always okay. It was always okay that that's what needed to happen, right? That he needed to go take care of other things, needed to get back to his house, whatever was happening, right? Oh, look forward to seeing you when I get to see you next, right? And however many days would come, and he'd come back. Oh, so great to see you. You know, what do we get? And we'd start to get into something, right? And we might hit that wall again, and oh, that's okay, no worries, right? And through this level of safety and it being okay to be having the experience you're having, right? And I started to notice, like, wow, we're starting to see this student a whole lot more. Like, they're starting to show up, like, to the schedule they've committed to. Like, all the days they said they were going to be here, like, they're coming here, right? And wow, next thing you know, like, we're here for most of the day, and actually we're working through that thing that was tough, right? And it was just this, like, slow roll over the course of a year to getting to that place where we could talk about those things we couldn't even touch in the beginning, right? I could say, hey, I'm noticing that every time we go to get into this thing, it gets really stressful really quick. Like, I'm noticing, like, I'm trying to offer this support, and you're meeting me in this way. You know, I'm wondering what's really happening, right? Like, trying to get into more of what's really going on, right? And eventually realizing, oh, I'm just working on this thing because I feel like I have to, because I feel like my parents are making me, or I feel like that's what I'm supposed to be doing here, right? Oh, and finally getting that place, but that's not what was relevant for him right now. That's not what was really necessary. We were able to put that to the side, pivot, and he came back to it 6 months later, and we moved through it in the course of, like, months. So the thing that would have taken, like, years to kind of, like, keep dragging someone through or trying to get back to it, right? All of a sudden we rocketed through it. And that was a student, right, that then had dropped out, had already like dropped out of high school, had come to us, could really barely get there more than a couple times a week, maybe once a week, and eventually coming full time, engaging in internships, right? And is off doing post-secondary education things and all kinds of things right now.
That's fantastic. Fantastic story. And one I know probably a lot of people in our audience can probably relate to. In fact, get to a comment here from Heather. Said this is the exact opposite of what the medical field is telling neurodivergent parents to do, and it's frustrating. I recently took a 12-week parenting course centered around neurodivergent anxiety, and they overemphasize pushing them to school no matter what. So thank you for saying this. And of course, this is not. I mean, it's not only the medical field, but it's a lot of folks in education. It also happens to be very much at the root of a lot of the beliefs around behavior of any kind, right? So, you know, we of course have this, you know, this science of behaviorism, you know, that is well over 100 years old, but a lot of it's based on kind of operant conditioning, reward, and, you know, consequence, and, you know, kind of the, okay, child's having a difficult time. We have we look at the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. And, you know, a lot of this is very focused on, again, reward, consequence, really trying to manipulate behavior, pushing behavior. And so many of these things are not only not working, but they actually end up escalating kids and pushing them absolutely in the wrong direction. So, I mean, you know, that approach goes back to kind of what we were talking about earlier, that idea of like safety and connection first. But how often, you know, have I heard or you heard this idea of, well, we've got to push them. I mean, what are we going to do otherwise? And, oh, well, you know, these academic concerns and you know, I mean, again, I've heard people pushing, well, you know, kindergartners' academic concerns, you know, that can wait, right? There's plenty of time. There's plenty of time to catch some of these things up. But, you know, how do you in your experience and
Yeah.
in thinking about, people that you've worked with, whether through consulting or through the school, how do you shift people to a different mindset? How do you shift people to realizing, some of these things are more important than others, and that we have to go about it in a certain way? So what are your thoughts?
Yeah. There's a lot of things I could say here. And one of the things I think I talk about is honestly like kind of the infinite growth model culture that we live in, right? And kind of challenging some of that in a sense, right? And kind of normalizing like, hey, this is what's been celebrated. Yeah, like we celebrate the workaholic, like we celebrate the person that like always is trying to take something further. We celebrate, right? And I always try to bring that to like, and that's just like one idea. That's just like one culture, right? Like we go to a lot of other places and that's not the like gold standard, right? And sort of talking about how like, and maybe there is something to value in the person that's like finding some balance and some boundaries. Maybe there is some, some wisdom in the like knowing myself and saying no, right? We want kids to be able to say no. To say no to things when they're older, but like we don't let them when they're young, right? So it's really interesting, and we wonder why we're dealing with such consent-based
we don't
issues,
give them
right?
bodily autonomy, and there's a whole host of things that we really put kids at a huge disadvantage. I always like Alfie Cohen says something to the effect of that kids learn to make decisions by making decisions, right?
Yeah.
And what do? We want to direct everything.
Yeah.
And it's such a wrong direction for kids.
Yeah. And I try to talk also about, therefore, that like the difference between school and learning, right? Because I think it's seen as synonymous, but I see them as very different things, right? And I think what can end up happening is when it's all about like getting back to the writing practice or the reading practice or all this academia, I think we can end up really valuing school and devaluing learning. Because what we're not talking about when we talk about that is like, you can't turn learning off. Like learning is always happening. It's just, what am I learning? Like I could be learning that it feels way better when I stay at home than when I go to school. Like I could be learning that. I could be learning to not trust myself. I could be learning like that this anxiety response around this stimulus, right? So I think we really miss the mark when we talk so much to kids about like, we need to be learning. We need to be learning the academia. We need to be doing, because it kind of forgets that like, our kids are learning all the time. And that thing that they're learning on, that they're watching on YouTube that you don't totally understand, what are some of the learnings that are happening there, right? And so I really just try to talk about how are we supporting learning right now? And when we talk about supporting learning, I mean, academic content is at the top of the pyramid.
Right.
Like that is, right? So like we need so many other foundational, and I find that when we can explore that and we can get into kind of like even some of the science of learning in that sense, right? That people can understand. Oh yeah, of course. We have to be in that space where we can think really abstractly. We have to be in that space where we can think in long stretches of time. We have to, and that's a really safe, regulated place in our nervous system.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and again, so many of the things that we're doing are not getting kids there. And so, we have, and I love what you're kind of saying there between education, kind of missing the learning part. And of course, the learning part is there, and so often kind of tamped down rather than fostered, which is really upsetting. We have in our community here, we have a lot of parents of kids who have found themselves on the wrong side of a lot of punitive discipline. We have a lot of self-advocates. We have a lot of educators, administrators, other related professionals. We've got a really broad community here. And, as I think about kind of the educators in our audience, what are some of the things that you might share with an educator who is kind of at the point where they realize that they want to do better, but somebody that's working with neurodivergent learners, what are some of the things that you might recommend to them, whether it's just kind of a change in mindset or even resources that you might recommend to them? What are some things that you might say to a educator out there that's wants to do better?
Yeah, and I first even just want to note that this is most educators, right? Like what you're describing is most educators, right? Most educators want to be doing the best for kids and are trying, right? And so as I think about so many of those educators, right, stuck in the systems and models that they're a part of, right? I think about that, exploring this understanding of the nervous system, exploring like, and this is like the work of polyvagal theory and Stephen Porges's stuff, right? And Deb Dana and even Mona Delahooke, right? And all of this stuff, but to get into like what actually happens in our physiological systems when I'm in different parts of my nervous system, and what does that give me access to? What does that not give me access to? Because that is a huge insight and impact onto what we can do in certain educational settings and what's accessible and what's accessible for learning. Because if as educators, we can understand, well, when we're in this part of our sympathetic system, like my ears are literally priming themselves to pay attention to lower frequency sounds than higher frequency, right? Like as we begin to understand all these aspects of the nervous system, we go, well, of course I'm not going to ask them to do it again. Like, of course I'm not going to dangle that punishment, right? But now again, the next step I think with this is bringing this to the model, bringing this to the school, bringing this to the district, bringing this, because I can't tell you as an educator receiving trainings and as an educator giving trainings, I have been in the situation where this is really great information, but given the model we're inside of, we can't actually use it. And so there is, and that's kind of the hard to hear message inside of some of this. It's not that we can't use it, but it's going to have we're going to run out of rope at some point, right? Like if ultimately I gotta get the student to do X, I can't really fully do what we're talking about, right? Like at some point the compliance is coming online, right? And so there's a lot that we can do to support students in little ways and in little shifts and changes and just the way that we talk. I would really encourage people to look into, again, nonviolent communication stuff, attachment-based theory stuff, right? All of these things. But I think a lot of it really does sit on some of the bigger foundational like models and policies of how these programs are run. Like, do we allow students to say, I'm not doing that? Right. Like, is that built into our model or not? Right. And these are the things that I would encourage teachers and educators who are getting curious about this and wanting to be exploring some of this, find this stuff out about your model, because that might be the difference of how much you want to invest into that model or whether you want to invest into a different model.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And what you were saying really resonates with me, because I have this really strong belief that kind of into the brain and the nervous system and that understanding that, I have this really strong belief that even a little bit of neuroscience goes a long way in helping us to see behavior differently, and helping us to see children differently, and helping us to see ourselves differently. And that knowledge is extremely powerful. When you begin to, kind of look at what you're seeing through that lens of kind of what's happening in the body, understanding kind of a stress response, even reframing the words that you use, and, rather than, so, I mean, there's so much hope there. And I always think about, Dr. Stuart Schenker, who I think so highly of. He's with the Merit Center, wrote book Self-Reg. And he says, you see a child differently, you see a different child, right? So much of it is changing the way that we look at ourselves and we look at each other. It sounds like we're probably very, very aligned in a lot of this in terms of, I agree with you. I mean, systems are broken. The system is broken. There are so many, and we have so many in our community, amazing educators out there that have gotten into this field for all of the right reasons, that want to help kids, especially when we begin to talk about, neurodivergent learners, and we talk about, children that we're really not serving well now. There's a lot of educators that even come with their own whys beneath that, right? In terms of what brought them to that area and why they really want to make a difference. But again, systems are broken, and systems, I did a presentation last fall at a conference on systemic trauma, and there's such a blind spot to the fact that systems of care, which, I would include education and schools,
Yep.
can cause trauma and
Yep.
can cause significant trauma. And, again, we think about that school avoidance, and I think about young children that are physically restrained or secluded or having these other things happen to them.
Yep.
And then they don't want to go back to school. Where else in the world would we make a child that was physically restrained, held down to the ground on a Monday, and then expect them to go back to school on Tuesday as if nothing happened,
Right.
without even acknowledging, kind of the impact and the trauma that's had on them. So,
Right.
I'm such a big believer in that kind of, getting, brain aware. Are there any, I certainly have my favorites, but are there any books or resources that you really like in terms of, a teacher that's curious about this or a parent that's curious about this? Anything you recommend?
Yeah, Deb Dana's book Anchored, I
Mm.
think gives a lot of application for it, especially for people exploring it themselves as they try to then kind of explore it with others. And that's kind of the other thing I was going to mention too, is I think like this gives such an opportunity to explore like our own nervous system
Right, right.
and like get really curious about that, right? And then it just brings curiosity online so much about this. So I love that Deb Dana book Anchored. Ned Johnson and William Stixrud have wrote some books, The Self-Driven Child. They wrote a book called What Do You Say? I think they get into talking a lot about some of these pieces too, but again, getting into like the application of like, how do we actually word some of these things a little bit different? Or how do you
Mhm.
approach or understand some of these nonverbals where it's not the time to ask the question or some of these things. And I also like, I'm just going to list off a couple that have been really inspiring to me too.
Sure.
It's like
Yep.
even like Bessel van der Kolk's Body Keeps the Score,
Mhm.
huge inside of all of this, I think. And there's also I was gonna mention Carl Rogers's work actually in like client-centered therapy work, because I think it speaks so much towards this too, because one of the things that he talks about is maintaining a general liking of the people you're working with, right?
Okay.
And I think about how without curiosity, without slowing down, without really getting to know someone else's nervous system and their sensitivities and their hypersensitivities, it's so easy to lose that general liking.
Right.
And then it's really hard to work with people.
Yeah. And I'm a firm believer that relationships are critical. And so many of the children that I have known and families that I've known, I mean, I used to say my son was a relationship kid, right?
Yeah.
But we're all dependent on relationships. We all do our best work for the people that we like, right?
Yeah.
Even just the fact that, think about the world today, and people are often on very different, have very different ideas and views about everything from politics to, all the things that you can imagine. We have very different views.
Yeah.
It seems that we're getting more and more, pushed apart by a lot of views that seem to separate us. But, if you think about relationships, I mean, when you see somebody through the lens of a relationship, you see them differently. You see them in an empathetic way. So, I mean, that piece is so critical. I mean, it just, there's so much potential when you take the time to foster and develop that relationship, especially when we're talking about kids.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That was leading me to also think about how relevant the declarative language work is for people, as we're also right trying to embody this work in the way that we talk, right? And so much of that is in how do we not put so much pressure in the way that we're even asking things of people, right? In some ways. And that's another way I think about that relationship piece, right? We ask in school, we ask kids like a lot of really vulnerable things before we really have relationship.
Right.
And so like, that's another consent piece I think about it too, is like, and of course, right, your whole organization exists because we haven't had this broad understanding of consent on a physical level, right? Like we're growing in that, hopefully, right? More and more physical consent happening in the world, right? But one of the things I think we miss a lot is like actually that mental thought consent we don't do with people, right? We just like ask a question to like take them deep into thinking about something, or we share our perspective and we don't first check in and go like, hey, I was thinking about something. Can I, like all of a sudden we like take their thoughts into something scary. or something, you know, and that's really hard to build relationship when like, I just thought I asked you a mundane question, but for you that sent off panic alarms.
Yeah. And there's such a, you know, especially when we're talking about very young children, when you look at data on things like restraint and seclusion, it's 5 and 6 year olds. You know, we seem to put no, you know, no thought into, you know, kind of invading a child's autonomy and their, you know, so I mean, there's much that needs to change for sure. Let me shift for a second. We talked a little bit about kind of, you know, educators. You work also with a lot of families. Can you tell me a little bit about the work that you do with families, and some of the things that are really that are part of that work? So tell me a little bit about your work supporting families.
Yeah, so I predominantly work with PDA families at this point, and sort of atypical profiles of autism, and I work with a lot. And you can imagine there's a lot of school trauma for some of those families, right? There's a lot of families that just are right from the get-go recognizing, hey, we're not going to go on this path to trauma. We're going to do something different, right? As they've heard other stories, right? Or seen things like that. And so my work is really in supporting a lot of families in navigating a place upon which they feel really stuck, which is like, we don't know what to do with about education. Our kid might be in total burnout because like the last 4 places haven't worked. And now like we can't try anything next yet because we're stuck in bed or we're stuck on video games or whatever that is. Right. So I work with a lot of families that have hit that burnout stuck place and are like, what do we do? Right. And it's a lot in talking about some of the things we're talking about. Sometimes it involves like education pieces, right? Like having to sort of educate the family on some of these pieces and why we might be exploring certain directions and not other directions. And helping the families really get clear on plans for that, strategizing around how they're approaching certain situations that maybe have become patterned and created a lot of conflict, right? By this time, there's often a lot of family conflict. So like there's a lot of rupture in the family. So a lot of my work is with parents. It's also with older kiddos. Sometimes it's with the whole family. Sometimes grandparents are getting involved, right? So to just understand, like, how do we show up in ways that are supportive for this person and are going to help them heal and grow? And how do I continue to heal and grow? Because I've got some traumas from all this too now, a little bit, right? And I've got some stuff that is really hard for me. And so it's a lot of pretty wraparound whole family work and helping them find some direction and clarity for what their family needs to experience more wonderfulness around education and learning and really just being a family.
You know, oftentimes a lot of the ideas and beliefs that people have are based on, you know, as somebody mentioned earlier, kind of what they were getting from the medical professionals or what they were getting from other parents or beliefs, you know, and when it comes to neurodivergent children, you know, the bad advice out there for families and parents. I mean, and there's a lot of it, right?
Yeah.
You know, this child needs this child needs that, this child needs consequences. You know, all of that advice out there. How do you go about kind of, and I hate to say this, but kind of like re-educating people? I mean, you know, we often do the things that we knew or the things that we learned. And my hope is, of course, that we're doing better, you know, for each generation here and moving things in a better direction. But there's probably a lot of unlearning and kind of re-education. What's your approach on that? I mean, in terms of, you know, I mean, somebody, you know, you're working with a family and you mentioned kind of even the broader family, and you know, grandma, grandpa, whoever it is, thinks that what this kid needs is this because you know they need. How do you approach that? Because it's a real problem. I mean, and I feel always for the parents and families as well, because often just doing the absolute best they can to kind of keep things moving forward. So how do you approach that with families?
Yeah, I approach with a lot of curiosity, right? Of sort of, like how has that worked, right? Like, and sort of, you know, trying to understand how these approaches have either worked or not worked. And oftentimes they haven't been working, right? So we might have to kind of recap on how it's not working though, right? So like if it would have worked already, it would have worked, right? And kind of just need to break down some of the logic there a little bit, right? And then kind of getting into describing what I've seen, right? What I've seen over the last 12 years doing this work with hundreds of families. And so that I'm also super clear where like you and your child are the expert for you and your child.
Yeah.
That like, I am not telling you this is the way to go, or this is what I can tell you that this is what I've experienced. This is what I've seen. You need to decide for yourself if it feels right to try that. And then you get to decide if it's working or not working. So I really bring people into, this is an experiential process. I am not here to deliver the equation to have it result in X for you, right? Like this is just for me to help you sift through this and explore this and decide what you want to taste and what you don't, and all of those pieces. And I find if I can hold people also in that, right, and hold people in that safe space, and like, oh yeah, and also like totally understanding why I have a proclivity to want to do something different than this. And I want, like, and that makes total sense because of some of my fears and anxieties that come up, right? That like, you can help people really explore this from less of a defensive place and more from a safe place where like I can actually explore it. And I'm not being asked to substitute something. I'm being asked to like entertain something and decide if I want to adopt it. And I find that's the same approach with kids too, right? If I ask a student to like, get rid of your idea and take my idea.
Right.
That's a really easy way to ping fear and defensiveness. Yeah. But if I can like offer this up as like another potential option to chew on, then you might explore it and then decide for yourself which one you want to keep.
Right. Yeah. Love it. So you mentioned a few minutes ago, PDA.
Yeah.
And of course, I think you and I got connected probably initially through, I want to say Diane Gould and PDA North America.
Yep.
And of course, somebody mentioned earlier that you're going to be speaking at the upcoming conference at PDA North America. And of course, I always like to not assume too much, when it comes to people that might be joining in and PDA, what's that?
Sure. Yep.
So I wonder if you would just tell us a little bit about what is PDA and why is a lot of your work focused on families and individuals, PDA? Yeah.
PDA, the most common sort of term out there for it is pathological demand avoidance. And everybody's got their thoughts on different terms, right? And we could get into all the history of how that sort of developed. Some people also will refer to it as pervasive drive for autonomy, right? There's all kinds of different sort of flavors that have come into that, but it's mostly known as pathological demand avoidance. And the whole idea with that being that it's an avoidance and resistance to everyday mundane demands, maybe even sometimes things that I want to do or I like, right? That I still like experience like an inability to do it, right? And that's what makes it kind of like, again, that's where that term pathological kind of comes from, is like, ooh, I'm having resistance to the thing that I want. What's going on here, right? It's really frustrating and confusing for those kiddos also, let alone the people that are supporting them in their lives, right? So this is a profile of the autism spectrum. We would kind of put into some of these other atypical profiles of the autism spectrum. So we can have really externalized versions of this, right? Where that big fight flight energy, lots of yelling, lots of big resistance, right? We can also have really internalized versions with high masking and lots of internalized shame cycles and all kinds of things. And this is a space where there can be a lot of stuckness that happens for kids, because again, you can imagine like, I want to go to school, but I keep not being able to. I keep like in the morning getting like stuck, and I just can't get myself to get my stuff together. And now maybe again, like maybe the shame cycles come online. So now I'm like stuck on the couch, really just like hating myself, but now I'm like yelling at my parents. Right. And it's all this very tension, conflict, all kinds, and I don't even maybe know what's going on. Right. And so another thing we see with the PDA profile a lot is like, can have some like low interoception skills a part of it, meaning like it's hard for me to know like what I'm experiencing, what I'm sensing. So that's the same thing that tells me whether I'm hungry or whether I like and want to do this activity. It might be that like that stuff's really hard for me to get clear on. So I'm like, so people want answers from me, and I'm like, I don't have them. They're like, do you want to come do this thing? And I don't know. I don't know if I want to. So then I just default to no, maybe, right? And so right, sensory sensitivities are a part of this experience, right? So again, an autism profile. I've found myself really drawn to that, I think for a few different reasons. those, even before I really learned about PDA, I then came to find out those are the kids I'm drawn to. Those are the kids that always seem to be drawn to me. Like those are just the people I've always seemed to be really working with, right? And so notice it was just kind of a natural thing for me. You know, I'm autistic myself, and as I've sort of learned about my own, you know, profile of autism and the really internalized version of it, and started to see, you know, see kids in me so much, right? And all of that, just feeling like I also can offer a lot of insight into all, even just some of my own experience that I hear from students going, yes, oh my gosh, yes, that's totally what's happening, right? And so so really wanting also to be a model for sort of living inside of some of this experience too, right? And like, and how to wield the superpowers of it and how to navigate the kryptonites of it, right? And all of this aspect, because that's what it is, right? Like there's so many aspects of my experience that are wildly distressing. But those parts, the other side of them, are also the things that are like the most magical and wonderful and allow me to do the work I do in some ways, right? So so yeah, I've just it seems like we found each other in so many ways, like me and the PDA, you know, world.
Sure. Well, you know, it's interesting because, you know, PDA, of course, has been recognized over in the UK for some time, and is still not really recognized officially here, kind of from a diagnostic standpoint. But it seems that, I mean, I was talking to Diane Gold recently, the executive director over at PDA North American, talking about how, you know, I'm hearing more and more awareness about PDA. And in fact, I've had some experiences where I've been pleasantly surprised to find school and school staff that actually seem to have some understanding. But the flip side of that is, and this recent, you know, parent had reached out, and like the school's like, you know, we don't recognize that. We don't recognize that as a thing. And regardless of whether you recognize something as a thing, shouldn't you be open to ideas to help you support your child? But so you know, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I mean, how do we bring people along? Because again, many of the approaches are that we're following for many neurodivergent kids aren't working. And I would say that, you know, again, kind of thinking about, you know, PDA individuals, that avoidance, that demand avoidance in a demand factory of a school, which is what it is. These are kids that are really going to have a difficult time, and these are kids that are going to end up on the wrong side of a lot of things. So, you know, have you had experience kind of trying to bring educators up to date on kind of what PDA is and how to approach working with individuals that have that PDA profile?
Yeah, definitely. Because, you know, and I do work with schools too, and that's part of my work is trying to help schools overhaul kind of programs and serve these kids more and things like that. And so what I'm finding is every month that seems to go by, more and more schools seem to be open to exploring this and getting support in this. So that is what I would say, like over the past 5 years, I've seen an overwhelming shift in that, actually, of more and more schools and exploring it and honoring it and wanting to learn more about it. And that's awesome. And that's super hopeful. And that's great. There's tons of resources out there for schools to get that. I also definitely have interfaced with those schools and work with those families where the schools won't, right? And what I tell families a lot of times is, you know, it's similar to how I describe working with kids in this way, right? Is like, well, if they're not interested, it's going to be really hard to convince them of that, right? In a sense. And so what I find is that rather than trying to continue to take that route of really hammering on PDA, as much as it's important, right? Yeah, like this needs to be recognized. Like you know, of course, right? I'm a huge advocate for this, right? But I know that we don't need to keep spamming on something that's not necessarily, it's not getting a foothold, right? And so, so what I find is sometimes when families have taken more of the route of really just focusing on the anxiety to a debilitating degree, like the panic, like the anxiety and panic experience, that's a part of it. And again, looking at like what is actually accessible and what's actually helpful to someone who's having like chronic panic and anxiety experience, like it's not exposure therapy. Like that's not what helps. Right. And so that's what I find kind of can help sort of shift, because that's what schools are essentially advocating for a lot of times, is like, let's just do exposure. Let's just keep exposing them and like sort of like smoothing this out. Right. And what we find is like, yeah, it's not like dandelions. You don't mow them over and they come back stronger every time. Like that's not how these kids work, right? And so, so how can we take a totally different approach to that, you know? And so that's what I find is like focusing on the anxiety and the panic sort of sometimes makes it more accessible, because now we're not focused on like the PDA acronym in this.
Gotcha. So I'm kind of looking at the time here and realizing that I could probably talk to you for another hour or two, but I will stick with my promise and not. So I want to pause real quickly and just say, anybody that's watching, if you have any final thoughts, comments, or questions, feel free to put those in the chat. And if we can get to one or two, we will. I'm going to ask kind of my final question, and we'll see if we have any more that show up in the chat as well. But again, thinking about your background and thinking about, it'd be easy to have another hour-long conversation with you. I was also thinking about kind of your focus on trauma. And of course, our community is one where there are a lot of, again, we have a lot of parents, we have a lot of self-advocates, we have a lot of individuals who have themselves experienced trauma related to schools. We have a lot of families, so if you look at, restraint, seclusion, those things being done to kids, you look at a lot of the other punitive approaches and the behavioral approaches that aren't working. And again, I'm getting you at the end of the discussion here. So, I realize you could probably talk about this in great depth, but any guidance, any hope, anything that you would offer parents or individuals that have experienced trauma related to a lot of these punitive things, what is your starting point, in terms of helping individuals that have been, often subjected to some things that are really harmful? What is your starting point for that?
Again, and we've said these words so many times, and I'll get into it a little bit more, but just such a meditation on healing and safety, right? So it's like, I describe it as a meditation because it really takes that. It takes like a constant reminder for myself as I'm trying to support someone in this, that like, oh yes, healing, safety. What is that really like? Consistent. I need consistent counter experience to counter what has led me to where I am, right? So if I have just like a week of it, but then I have another really hard day at school or something, that week before might get kind of erased in some way, right? Because I need consistent counter experience. So what I tell parents is also like, so meditating on that, the safety, and sorry, I'm thinking about so many things right now. I'm healing, safety and healing. And knowing that we have so much time, because I think what happens for parents, and I'm a parent myself, 6 and 7-year-old boys. It's really easy to feel the catastrophizing of, but next year, or if we don't get to hear by then what's going to happen then? And then are they ever going to be able to make their own living and have their own, right? And next thing you know, we're like 20 years in the future, right? And what I always tell parents is like, we have so much time, right? We have so much time to create opportunity to connect. We have so much time to reflect on the experience we're having. We have so much time to rediscover interests and ways of stretching myself. And so I really try to hammer on that like everything outside of you is going to try to tell you there's not enough time. You're running out of time. That message you are going to see around every corner. You're going to get that from the schools. You're going to get that on social media. You're going to get that when you talk to your friends and hear what they're doing with their kids. You're going to get this message that you're running out of time. And I just want people to know you have so much time. You have a lifetime.
Yeah. I agree. And there's things that are more important than other things, and that safety, that connection, that relationship, those things come first. And I've lived through an experience with my son as well, where, he had, he experienced restraint and seclusion, had trauma from that, actually moved into a non-traditional kind of school environment after that. A lot of the focus was really on kind of connection and, healing. And, at times I worried that, well, maybe they're not pushing, hard enough academically, but that wasn't what was important. And you know what? He started college this past fall, and he's just blossomed. I mean, like, he developed these skills I never even knew he had.
Yeah. Yeah.
But again, the important thing is really that safety, that connection, that healing. You can always catch up on, learning topics and learning information. That's not the priority. The priority is the human being and raising the human being, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And if I can say one more thing about that too, right? And just in sort of even about like my own kids and things, right? And like my kids, I'm a bonus dad. My kids are children of divorce, right? They have some of their own traumas, neurodivergencies, right? All of these things is that, again, there's so many messages in our culture of what people should be able to do at certain, and what they should be doing at certain ages and stages, right? And I can just tell everybody that and again, I'm not trying to tell anybody how to live their lives or decisions to make, right? Everybody do you, right? But for myself, to help give myself that sense of time, to help myself lean into having so much of that time, I'm already trying to set myself up to plan on, maybe my kids will be 28 and we'll all still be living in the same house. And right. And if, not that I'm trying to keep them here, but meaning like, it's totally fine. And I'm trying to orient to that. I want them to orient to that, right? So that we all don't feel this like pressure when they're 16, and then so that we actually can because that's when we're not efficient. We're often not efficient under that high pressure, right? And so I think whatever you can do for yourself to also help you stretch that time for yourself in ways, again, that align with your core values and your needs and your resources and all of that. That's just the way I'm thinking about it too, is how do I stretch that time for myself so that if we need it, we have it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, again, I think the whole idea of respecting individual differences, whatever they may be, is so critical. Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, I think about what you're saying as you were talking about. Oh yeah, the kids. My son now is 18 and started college in the fall. My daughter is now 14, and it makes me sad to think that one day they're gonna want to leave. But, and in fact, over the fall semester, I actually spent quite a bit of time. I kind of lived between two houses for the fall. I stayed up with my son for part of the time, was at our house part of the time. I kind of like, and it's been actually this amazing transition. Like, the whole thought of any child just kind of being dumped off at college, like, okay, college starts, here you go. Yeah. Go do all these things. But it's really been a fantastic time for us. And again, respecting kind of the individual differences and finding what works for, our children, our families, the people that we're working with, I think is so critical. Yeah. Well, I want to hit a couple of comments here real quickly, and we'll wrap up. Christina Keller says, thank you so much, Guy and Zach. I had the pleasure of working with Zach regarding my homeschooled PDA son, and he's been extremely helpful. And to that point, I wanted to ask you, Zach, so if there are people that are watching this that are interested in Christina, as I recall, is in Ohio, you're in Montana. Yeah. So I'm assuming that you have the ability to work with people even if they're not geographically right next to you, they're in Montana? Yeah. Correct. Okay. Yeah. And if somebody was interested in working with you in some way, what's the best way for them to reach out and connect with you?
Yeah, really. Just my website, aliveatlearn.com. Okay. Contact form goes right there to me. So
look at that. As soon as you said it, Courtney made it come up. She like she was waiting for it. Great. Yeah, I'd certainly encourage people to do that. Let me go through a couple more of these comments here if you have a second. Yeah. Wendy says, I have a child, 99% sure he is undiagnosed PDA. We are stuck in school burnout / trauma. How do we reverse the conversation with school to not talk about exposure therapy? I feel like our only option is homeschooling. I'm not opposed, but overwhelmed with the idea. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Hearing just like burnout, leads me to just get curious about how much we might be able to shift that experience at the current school. I can just sort of say for kids that I've seen get into burnout, I don't know if I have, and I've worked with hundreds of PDA kids. I don't know if I have any stories of a kid experiencing burnout and then coming out of that burnout at the same school. That there's too much trauma there, right? There's too much sort of history there in a sense. So I would just get really curious around like whether that's even kind of like doable or how much you want to sort of advocate for that in a sense. Again, I would just get really clear on some of your questions on what you need to know if they're willing to, what they're willing to entertain or not. And if not, I would really encourage just exploring options at that point. Maybe talk to some supports on navigating some of those homeschool things to make that seem more manageable. I'm definitely not trying to push you in that direction at all, but more just saying, yeah, that once someone arrives at burnout, it can be really hard to repair that experience in the same environment.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And again, Wendy would encourage you, if you're interested in connecting with Zach, to reach out as well. All right. And a couple of comments here. So glad I caught this conversation. Got a nice heart there from Erica. Let's see. We definitely get that from the school. And I don't remember what point we were on there, but
yeah, pressure, I think. Pressure.
Yeah, I think so. Let's see. And it's the constraints placed on us by system side, sadly, right?
Yeah.
Great advice. We are pressured to do so much to do, make our son do this instead of meeting them where they are. The medical professionals blow my mind sometimes.
Yeah.
Anyway, we are past time here, and I apologize about that, because I try to stick to time, but we're not too far past. But I want to give you one opportunity for any final thoughts, final words that you have as we wrap up here today. Anything you want to leave us with?
I just want to thank parents for being strong advocates for their child. I think it's the greatest gift you can give your child, is advocating for your child and putting that first, right? And I know the pressure is to like tend to the state and tend to the school and tend to these other people, but it is such a gift, and it is so courageous and so brave to attend to the needs of your child before those other things, because there are risks to that at times. And so I just want to say, I see you. I'm so grateful for you. It is such a gift to give these kids. And it's really special, and it takes a lot of courage. So.
Well, speaking of a lot of courage, I appreciate the courage that you've had throughout your life here, whether it was, taking a leap to start a school at 23, or all the other things that you've done. I thank you for sharing your authentic experience with us, and sharing the guidance that you've shared. It's been a great conversation, and I knew when we talked before, I love having these conversations, because I think it's really helpful to a lot of folks, and a lot of folks, as you were addressing, kind of that are really, a lot of parents in places where they're really trying hard and pushing up against systems that are that drain the life out of you at times. But I think continuing to learn and try to do the right thing makes such a difference. So I want to thank you for spending some time with me here this afternoon. Really a pleasure to talk to you. And of course, you will be at the PDA North America conference here next month, I guess.
Yeah, I'll be actually out in Chicago live.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. Well, I was hoping to be. I actually talked to Diane. I was hoping to be able to potentially go this year, but I've got some other travel that's happening, kind of, and that's right in between. And I thought, well, I don't know, but I'm going to make it a priority next year to be there. Of course, I sit on the board of PDA North America, so the organization is near and dear to my heart, and they do some great work. You can hang around for a second. We're going to let everybody else go, but I'm going to just catch you 1 second to give you one final thank you and goodbye. But to everybody that was out here watching today, thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you again next time.
Thanks, Guy. Thanks, everyone.
See ya.